The scream that tore through Grace Whitmore's throat as she held her dying mother echoed through the small cabin. And when the fever finally claimed the woman 3 days later, the whispers began spreading through Taylorsville like wildfire through dry Montana grass. Grace was only 19 years old when they branded her cursed, when the people she had grown up with started crossing to the other side of the dusty street whenever she walked to the general store, when mothers pulled their children close and made signs against evil as she passed. It was 1876, and superstition ran as deep as the roots of the cottonwood trees that lined the creek on the edge of town. Her mother had been the fourth person to die of fever in as many months, and Grace had been present at each deathbed, trying desperately to nurse them back to health with her knowledge of herbs and healing. But death came anyway, indifferent to her prayers and remedies. The town decided she was not a healer but a harbinger. When old Tom Fletcher collapsed in his barn and Grace found him there trying to help, he died in her arms. When little Sarah Mills took sick and Grace brought medicine, the child passed that very night. The pattern was undeniable to those looking for someone to blame, someone to explain away the random cruelty of disease and death. The pastor, Reverend Morrison, did nothing to dispel the rumors. In fact, he seemed to encourage them from his pulpit, speaking of how evil could wear a comely face, how the devil's servants could appear as angels of mercy. Grace sat in the back pew, her dark hair covered by a simple bonnet, her green eyes downcast, and endured it because this was the only home she had ever known. Her father had died in a mining accident when she was 10, and her mother had raised her alone, teaching her to read and write, to tend a garden, to be kind. Those lessons felt hollow now as kindness was repaid with suspicion, and learning was seen as further evidence of her otherworldliness. The final straw came on a cold October morning when Grace woke to find a crude symbol painted on her door in what looked like blood, but was probably just red paint. The message was clear. She packed what few belongings she could carry in a worn carpet bag, took her mother's Bible and her father's hunting knife, and left Taylorsville before dawn broke fully over the mountains. She had no destination in mind, only knew she needed to head away from town, away from the accusing stares and whispered curses. The mountain trail was rough, meant more for game than people, but Grace followed it upward into the wilderness of the Montana Territory. She had some dried meat, a bit of bread, and a canteen of water. It would have to be enough until she figured out what came next. 3 days into her journey, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks like a gray ocean wave, and the temperature dropped so quickly that Grace's breath became visible puffs in the air. She had been rationing her food carefully, but the climb had taken more energy than she anticipated, and she was hungrier than she wanted to admit. Her boots, suitable for walking through town, were not made for mountain hiking, and her feet ached with every step. When the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and heavy, Grace knew she was in trouble. She had no proper shelter, no way to make a fire in this wind, and night was coming on fast. She pressed forward, hoping to find an overhang or cave, anything to get out of the elements. The trail became harder to see as snow accumulated, and her fingers inside her thin gloves had gone numb. Just when despair began to settle in her chest alongside the cold, she spotted smoke rising from somewhere ahead and below, barely visible through the curtain of snow. Where there was smoke, there was fire. Where there was fire, there might be shelter. Grace changed direction, moving carefully down the slope, using trees to steady herself as the ground became slick. The cabin materialized out of the storm like something from a dream. It was solidly built from thick logs, with a stone chimney from which that blessed smoke rose. A barn stood nearby, and she could hear horses inside, their gentle sounds muffled by the weather. Grace stumbled toward the door, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion. She raised her fist to knock, but the door swung open before her knuckles could connect with wood. The man who stood there was the largest human being Grace had ever seen. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that nearly filled the doorway. His hair was dark brown, almost black, hanging past his collar, and his beard was thick and well kept. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray as the storm clouds, assessing her with an intelligence that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. He wore a simple wool shirt and dark trousers held up by leather suspenders. "Please," Grace managed through chattering teeth. "I need help." He did not hesitate. One large hand reached out and gently but firmly pulled her inside, out of the wind and snow. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical force, and she swayed on her feet. "Sit," he said, his voice a deep rumble. He guided her to a chair near the stone fireplace where a healthy fire blazed. "You are half frozen." Grace collapsed into the chair, her legs finally giving out. She watched through blurred vision as the mountain man moved around the cabin with surprising grace for someone so large. He hung her carpet bag on a peg, then returned with a heavy blanket that he wrapped around her shoulders. He knelt before her and began unlacing her boots. "I can do that," Grace protested weakly. "Your fingers are too cold," he replied matter-of-factly. "Sit still." He removed her boots and her soaked stockings, then wrapped her feet in a dry cloth before setting them on a small stool near the fire. He disappeared and returned with a tin cup full of something hot. "Drink slow," he instructed. "Too fast and you will be sick." Grace took the cup in her trembling hands and sipped. It was broth, rich and hot, flavored with herbs. It tasted like life itself. She sipped slowly as instructed, feeling warmth begin to spread from her core outward. The man stood and moved to the stove, where a pot was already simmering. He ladled more broth into a bowl, cut thick slices of bread from a loaf, and brought it all to a small wooden table. "When you are ready," he said, gesturing to the food. Grace realized he had not asked her name, had not asked what she was doing on the mountain in a snowstorm, had not asked anything at all. He had simply helped. The kindness of it, after weeks of cruelty, brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then moved to the other side of the cabin, giving her space. Grace watched him as she drank her broth. The cabin was simple but well maintained. There was a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, the fireplace, a cooking area, and shelves lined with books. Books. That surprised her. She had expected a mountain hermit to be illiterate, but the collection on those shelves suggested otherwise. When she felt steady enough, Grace moved to the table and ate. The broth was even better in the bowl, and the bread was fresh, probably baked that morning. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that the man was now seated in another chair, working on what looked like a leather harness, his large hands surprisingly deft. "My name is Grace," she finally said. "Grace Whitmore." He looked up from his work. "Gideon Fletcher." Grace's breath caught. "Fletcher? Are you related to Tom Fletcher from Taylorsville?" Something shifted in Gideon's expression. "He was my father. You knew him." "I was there when he died," Grace said quietly. "I tried to help him, but the fever was too strong. I am so sorry." Gideon set down the harness. "My father wrote me before he passed. He said a young woman with kind hands tried to ease his pain, that she stayed with him so he would not die alone. That was you." "Yes," Grace whispered, though the town did not see it that way. "The town labeled you cursed," Gideon said. It was not a question. Grace stared at him. "How did you know?" "My father's letter mentioned the foolish talk. He did not believe it. He said you were the only one who showed him any real compassion in his final hours." Gideon's gray eyes were steady on hers. "That is not a curse. That is a blessing." The words struck Grace like a physical blow. A blessing. After weeks of being called cursed, of being feared and shunned, this stranger, this mountain of a man, called her a blessing. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She covered her face with her hands, and great sobs shook her shoulders. All the fear and loneliness and grief she had been holding inside came pouring out. She wept for her mother, for the life she had lost, for the cruelty of people she had thought were her friends. She did not hear Gideon move, but suddenly he was there, kneeling beside her chair. He did not touch her, but his presence was solid and comforting. "You are safe here," he said quietly. "The storm will last through the night. You may stay as long as you need." Grace nodded, unable to speak. She wiped her eyes with the blanket and took a shaky breath. "I left Taylorsville," she managed. "I had nowhere else to go." "Where were you heading?" "I do not know. Away. Anywhere but there." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The next town is 50 miles north. The trail is not safe this time of year, especially with winter coming early. You would not make it." Grace felt a fresh wave of despair. "Then what do I do?" "You stay here through the winter," Gideon said simply. "In the spring, when the pass is clear, I will take you wherever you want to go." "I cannot impose on you for months," Grace protested. "It is not an imposition. I have space, food enough for two, and the company would be welcome." He stood and moved back to his chair. "But the choice is yours. You may leave in the morning if you wish, though I would not recommend it." Grace looked at this man who had shown her more kindness in 1 hour than her entire town had shown her in weeks. She thought about returning to Taylorsville, thought about trying to brave the mountain passes with winter setting in, thought about the alternative of staying here with a stranger. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. Gideon looked at her directly. "Because you were kind to my father, because you need help, because it is the right thing to do." He paused. "And because I know what it is like to be judged unfairly." "What do you mean?" He gestured to himself. "Look at me. I am too big, too rough, too different. The town was never comfortable with me, even as a child. When I grew to this size, people feared me without reason. After my mother died when I was 16, I came up here to the mountain. That was 8 years ago. I go down to trade twice a year, and that is enough." "You have been alone up here for 8 years?" Grace asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I have my horses, the wildlife, my books. It is a good life." His expression softened slightly, but perhaps a bit lonely at times. Grace made her decision. "I will stay through the winter if you truly mean it. I can earn my keep. I know how to cook, clean, tend a garden. I can help with the horses." "I mean it," Gideon said. "And I will not turn away help. This is a working homestead, not a charity house. If you stay, we work together." "Agreed." Grace felt some of the weight lift from her shoulders. She had a place to stay, at least for a few months. It was more than she had dared hope for that morning. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Gideon showed her around the cabin, which was larger than it had first appeared. There was a small room off the main area that he had been using for storage, and he cleared it out for her, setting up a simple bed frame with a corn husk mattress. "It is not much," he apologized. "It is wonderful," Grace said honestly. She had her own room, her own space. It felt like a luxury. That night, lying in her small room listening to the wind howl outside, Grace felt a strange sense of peace. She was far from everything she had known, alone with a man she had just met, in the middle of a wilderness. By all rights, she should have been terrified. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. The next morning, Grace woke to find several inches of snow had fallen overnight and more was coming down. Gideon was already up, making breakfast. He had prepared eggs from his chickens, which he kept in a small coop attached to the barn, and more of that excellent bread with butter and jam. The chickens provide well, Gideon explained as they ate. "I have 4 laying hens. The cow gives milk for butter and cheese. I hunt for meat and grow vegetables in the warm months. I trade furs and leather goods for what I cannot produce." "You are entirely self-sufficient," Grace observed. "As much as possible. The mountain demands it." After breakfast, Gideon bundled up to tend to the animals. Grace insisted on helping, and he found her a coat that was far too large but better than her thin shawl. Together they went to the barn, where Grace met his 3 horses: a large black gelding named Shadow, a brown mare named Willow, and a younger gray mare named Storm. "Storm was born during a blizzard 2 years ago," Gideon explained as Grace stroked the horse's soft nose. "She nearly did not make it, but she fought hard. She is strong now." Grace helped distribute hay and fresh water, learning the routine. The chickens were next, funny little birds that clucked and fussed. The cow, a placid brown creature named Bessie, required milking, which Gideon handled with practiced ease. Back in the cabin, they settled into a rhythm. Gideon worked on his leathercraft while Grace familiarized herself with the kitchen supplies and began planning meals. She found his stores well organized and plentiful: jars of preserved vegetables and fruits, smoked meats, dried beans and grains. "You are well prepared for winter," she commented. "It is necessary. We will be snowed in for weeks at a time up here." The reality of that hit Grace. She would be completely isolated with this man, no contact with the outside world until spring. She studied him as he worked, his large hands manipulating the leather with surprising delicacy. He had been nothing but respectful and kind. She decided to trust her instincts, which told her she was safe with Gideon Fletcher. The days began to form a pattern. They woke early, tended the animals together, ate breakfast, then divided the work. Gideon would hunt or work on his leather goods or maintain the property. Grace would cook, clean, tend to the indoor chores. In the evenings they would eat dinner together and Gideon would read aloud from his books. His taste in literature surprised her. He had volumes of poetry, adventure novels, even some philosophy. His voice, reading the words, was deep and soothing. Grace would work on mending or knitting, listening, sometimes commenting. They talked about the stories, about ideas, about nothing and everything. Grace learned that Gideon was 24, just 5 years older than her. He had taught himself to read from his mother's books and had continued to educate himself even in isolation. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and far more cultured than most of the men she had known in Taylorsville. "Why did you never marry?" Grace asked one evening, immediately regretting the personal question. "Forgive me, that was too forward," but Gideon did not seem offended. What woman would want this life? Isolated on a mountain, far from society, and in town they feared me. Not ideal circumstances for courting. "You are not fearsome," Grace said softly. He looked at her, something unreadable in his gray eyes. "You are not cursed." They sat in comfortable silence after that, but something had shifted between them, some understanding reached without words. As October gave way to November, the snow piled higher. Gideon had been right about being snowed in. There were days when opening the cabin door revealed a wall of white, and they had to dig a path to the barn. But the work was shared, and Grace found herself growing stronger, more capable. Her hands, which had been soft from town living, developed calluses. Her body, which had been thin from grief and poor eating, filled out from regular meals and hard work. She also found herself watching Gideon more than she probably should. The way he moved, economical and sure despite his size. The way his face softened when he read poetry. The way he was always gentle with the animals, with her. He never crowded her, never made her uncomfortable, but she was aware of him always. One evening in late November, A particularly fierce storm raged outside. The wind screamed around the cabin and snow battered the walls. Grace was helping Gideon prepare dinner when her hand slipped on the knife she was using to chop vegetables. The blade sliced across her palm, not deep but enough to bleed freely. "Oh," she gasped, more surprised than hurt. Gideon was at her side instantly. He took her hand gently, examining the cut. "Not too bad, but it needs cleaning and binding." He led her to a chair and retrieved a basin of clean water and cloth. With movements that were surprisingly tender, he washed the cut, applied a salve that smelled of herbs, and wrapped her hand in clean linen. "You are good at this," Grace said, watching his face as he concentrated on the bandage. "I have to be living alone, cannot afford to let injuries fester." His hands were so large that they engulfed hers completely, yet his touch was careful, almost reverent. When he finished, he did not immediately release her hand. For a moment they sat there, connected, and Grace felt her heart begin to beat faster. Gideon seemed to realize he was still holding her hand and released it quickly, standing up and moving away. "You should rest that hand tonight. I will finish dinner." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. She was feeling things she had no business feeling, developing an attachment that could only complicate matters. In the spring, she would leave, find some town where she could start over. This was temporary. She needed to remember that. But as November turned to December, and December brought the deepest snows, Grace found it harder and harder to remember that this was not permanent. The cabin felt like home. The routine felt right. And Gideon felt like someone she could trust, could care about, maybe even love. The realization that she was falling in love with him came on a clear December morning. The storm had passed, and the world outside was transformed into a wonderland of white. Gideon suggested they take a walk, and Grace eagerly agreed, desperate to get out of the cabin for a while. They bundled up and stepped into a world of sparkling snow and blue sky. The sun was brilliant on the white landscape, almost blinding. Gideon led her along a path he had broken earlier, up to a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The view was breathtaking. Mountains stretched as far as the eye could see, their peaks white against the bright sky. The valley was a pristine blanket of snow, broken only by the dark line of the creek and the occasional cluster of evergreens. "It is beautiful," Grace breathed. "I never tire of it," Gideon said. "Up here, away from people and their judgments, I can just be." Grace looked at him, at his profile against the sky, and her heart swelled with emotion so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. She loved him. She loved his kindness, his intelligence, his strength, his gentleness. She loved the way he read poetry and the way he cared for his animals and the way he had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. "Grace," Gideon was looking at her with concern. "Are you all right? You look flushed." "I am fine," she managed, "just overwhelmed by the beauty." But she was not looking at the mountains anymore. She was looking at him. If Gideon noticed, he did not say anything. They stood together on that ridge, and Grace made herself a promise. She would not burden him with her feelings. He had given her shelter out of kindness, not because he wanted anything from her. In the spring, she would go, and he would return to his solitary life. It was only right, but keeping that promise proved harder than she anticipated. Christmas came, and Grace used some of the supplies to make a special dinner. She had been saving a bit of sugar and dried fruit, and she made a small cake, more of a sweet bread really, but Gideon's face when he tasted it was worth the effort. "I have not had anything like this since my mother died," he said softly. "Thank you, Grace. Thank you for giving me a place to spend Christmas," she replied. "Otherwise, I would have been alone." "I would have been alone too," Gideon said, meeting her eyes. "This is better." He had made her a gift, she discovered. A pair of leather gloves fitted to her hands, soft and warm and beautifully crafted. She had made him a new shirt from fabric she had found in his supplies, sitting up late by firelight to get the stitching right. They exchanged gifts on Christmas morning, and the look on Gideon's face when he held up the shirt was something Grace would treasure forever. "No one has made me anything since my mother," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It is perfect." "Try it on," Grace urged. He did, and it fit well, the fabric stretching across his broad shoulders exactly as she had hoped. He looked down at himself, then at her, and the warmth in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. "Thank you," he said simply. They spent Christmas Day in comfortable companionship, eating the special meal, reading together, talking. It was the best Christmas Grace could remember, better even than the ones from her childhood. It felt right in a way she could not quite explain. January brought brutal cold and more snow. There were days when they barely left the cabin, huddled near the fire while the wind raged outside. Grace and Gideon talked for hours, sharing stories from their lives, their hopes and fears and dreams. Grace told him about her mother, about the pain of watching her die, about the guilt she still carried for not being able to save her. Gideon listened without judgment, then shared his own grief over losing his mother, the isolation he had felt even before leaving town. "People do not understand what they fear," he said. "You were different because you could read and write and think for yourself. I was different because of my size. They needed someone to blame for bad things, and you were convenient." "You ever get angry about it?" Grace asked. "About being driven away, sometimes," Gideon admitted. "But mostly I am grateful. Up here I am free. Down there I was always trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less. Here I can be exactly who I am." "I understand that," Grace said. "These past months I have felt more myself than I ever did in Taylorsville." "You are remarkable," Gideon said suddenly. "You know that, do not you? You survived loss, survived cruelty, walked into the mountains in a storm, and now you thrive here. You are strong." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I do not feel strong. I feel like I am barely holding on." "Strength is not the absence of fear or pain," Gideon said. "It is continuing despite them. You do that every day." She wanted to tell him that he made her strong, that his presence gave her something to hold on to, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she just nodded and wiped her eyes. February came with slightly warmer temperatures, and the first signs that winter might eventually end. The days were still short and cold, but occasionally the sun would break through the clouds with real warmth. Gideon began talking about spring, about the work that would need to be done once the snow melted. Every mention of spring made Grace's heart sink because spring meant leaving. She tried to think about where she would go, what she would do, but every future she imagined felt gray and empty without Gideon in it. She knew she needed to tell him how she felt. It was not fair to either of them to keep pretending. But the fear of rejection, of making things awkward for the remaining weeks of winter, kept her silent. The decision was taken out of her hands on a bright February afternoon. Grace was in the barn, helping Gideon muck out the stalls. It was hard, smelly work, but she had grown to enjoy it, the simple physicality of it, the companionship. She was laughing at something Gideon had said when she turned too quickly, and her foot caught on a rake handle. She stumbled, arms windmilling, and would have fallen hard if Gideon had not caught her. His large hands gripped her arms, steadying her, and suddenly she was pressed against his chest, looking up into his face. Time seemed to stop. They stared at each other, and Grace saw something in Gideon's eyes that made her heart race. It was not just concern or friendship. It was want, deep and unmistakable. "Grace," he said, her name barely a whisper. "Yes," she breathed, not even sure what she was agreeing to, just knowing she wanted whatever came next. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. When his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, almost questioning. Grace answered by rising on her toes, pressing closer, and the kiss deepened. It was everything a kiss should be. Tender but passionate, sweet but urgent. Gideon's arms wrapped around her, and Grace felt safer and more wanted than she had ever felt in her life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I did not plan that," he said. "I am glad it happened anyway," Grace replied. He pulled back to look at her. "I have feelings for you. I have tried to respect the fact that you are here out of necessity, not choice. But Grace, I cannot keep pretending I do not care for you." "I have feelings for you too," Grace confessed. "I have for weeks now. I did not say anything because I thought you were just being kind, giving me shelter. I did not want to presume." "You are not presuming." Gideon cupped her face with one large hand. "You are the best thing to happen to me in years. When I think about spring, about you leaving, I cannot bear it." "Then do not think about it," Grace said. "Or better yet, think about me staying." "Stay?" Gideon's eyes widened. "You would want to stay here on the mountain." "I love it here," Grace said honestly. "I love the peace, the simplicity, the beauty. I love the life we have built together. And I love you, Gideon Fletcher." The smile that spread across Gideon's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I love you too, Grace Whitmore. I think I have since you stumbled to my door in that snowstorm." He kissed her again, and Grace felt like her heart might burst from happiness. All the pain of the past year, all the loss and fear and loneliness, it had led her here, to this moment, to this man. Maybe that was the blessing in the curse. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the barn, talking and kissing and making plans. Gideon wanted to marry her properly, wanted to take her down to the next town when the passes cleared and find a preacher. Grace agreed, though in her heart, she already felt married to him. That night, they sat close together by the fire, Gideon's arm around Grace's shoulders, her head on his chest. They talked about their future, about expanding the cabin, about the children they might have someday, about growing old together on this mountain. "Are you certain you will not miss town life?" Gideon asked. "The company, the society. Town life brought me nothing but pain," Grace said. "Here I have everything I need. I have you." "You have me," Gideon confirmed, kissing the top of her head. "Always." March brought the beginning of the thaw. Snow began to melt, revealing brown grass and mud. The creek swelled with runoff and the animals grew more active, sensing spring. Grace and Gideon worked side by side, repairing winter damage, planning the garden, preparing for the busy months ahead. They also began preparing for their trip to town. It would be a 2-day ride to the nearest settlement large enough to have a preacher. Gideon had not been planning to make a trading trip until May, but this was more important. "I want you to be my wife before the summer," he said. "I want it official and proper." Grace agreed, though she had some trepidation about going to town, even one where nobody knew her. The memory of Taylorsville's rejection was still fresh. They set out on a clear April morning, riding Shadow and Willow, with Storm following on a lead. The journey was beautiful, the trail winding through valleys just beginning to green up, past streams swollen with snowmelt. They camped one night under the stars, and Gideon held Grace close as they slept, keeping her warm. The town was called Harmony Ridge, Wyoming, just over the border from Montana. It was small but friendly, and no one looked at Grace with suspicion or fear. They found a preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Thomas, who agreed to marry them the next day. That night, Gideon used some of his saved money to get them a room at the small boarding house. They stayed in separate rooms, preserving propriety for one more night, though Grace wished she could have stayed with him. The wedding took place in the small church the next morning. They had no guests besides Reverend Thomas and his wife, who served as witnesses. Grace wore her best dress, which was not much, but Gideon looked at her like she was dressed in silk and jewels. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other all their days. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife and told Gideon he could kiss his bride, Grace felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "I love you, Mrs. Fletcher," Gideon whispered against her lips. "I love you too, Mr. Fletcher," Grace replied. They spent one more night in Harmony Ridge, this time sharing a room as husband and wife. Gideon was gentle and patient, making Grace's first time everything it should be. They loved each other through the night, and Grace marveled at how perfectly they fit together, how right everything felt. The ride back to the mountain took longer because they kept stopping to kiss, to talk, to simply be together as a married couple. When the cabin finally came into view, Grace felt her heart swell. This was home now, truly home. Spring turned to summer and they settled into married life. Grace's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables. Gideon hunted and fished, keeping them supplied with meat. They worked together on everything, partners in the truest sense. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch Gideon built that spring, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about their day, making love under the stars. Grace had never been happier. By late summer, Grace began to suspect she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses and felt queasy in the mornings. She wanted to be sure before telling Gideon, so she waited, watching for other signs. When she was certain, she planned a special dinner. She made all of Gideon's favorite foods and put on her best dress. When he came in from working on the new addition to the cabin, he looked at her in surprise. "What is the occasion?" he asked. "We are celebrating," Grace said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Celebrating what?" "We are going to have a baby." The expression on Gideon's face went through several changes: shock, joy, wonder, before settling on pure happiness. He crossed the room in 2 strides and swept Grace into his arms, spinning her around. "We are having a baby," he repeated like he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents. In the spring," Grace confirmed. "Around April, I think." Gideon set her down carefully like she was made of glass. "Should you be on your feet? Should you be resting?" Grace laughed. "I am pregnant, not ill. I can still do my work." But Gideon was already planning, already worrying in the way of expectant fathers everywhere. He insisted on taking over the heavier chores, would not let Grace lift anything he deemed too heavy, fussed over her constantly. Grace found it endearing, though she had to remind him regularly that she was perfectly capable. As fall arrived, and the leaves turned gold and red, Grace's belly began to show. Gideon would place his large hands on the small swell and marvel at the life growing inside her. He talked to the baby, told it stories, sang songs he remembered from his childhood. "I hope the baby has your kindness," he said one night, his hand on her stomach. "I hope the baby has your strength," Grace replied. "I hope the baby knows how much it is already loved," Gideon said softly. Winter came again, and Grace spent much of it preparing for the baby. She sewed tiny clothes, knitted blankets, made everything ready. Gideon built a cradle from smooth pine, carving it carefully and making sure there were no rough edges. As Grace grew larger, Gideon grew more protective. He barely let her out of his sight, worried about her slipping on ice or overexerting herself. Grace tolerated it with good humor because she knew it came from love. The baby was due in early April, but as March drew to a close, Grace began to feel the first twinges of labor. It was early evening and she was helping Gideon with dinner when the first real contraction hit. She gasped and gripped the table. Gideon was at her side instantly. "What is wrong?" "I think the baby is coming," Grace said, breathing through the pain. Gideon's face went pale. They had prepared as best they could, reading the medical book Gideon had purchased on their last trip to Harmony Ridge, gathering supplies, but the reality of actually delivering the baby was suddenly terrifying. "It is going to be all right," Grace said, more to reassure herself than Gideon. "Women have babies every day." "Not my wife," Gideon said, "not up here with no doctor or midwife." "You will help me," Grace said firmly. "We will do this together." The labor was long and hard. Gideon stayed by Grace's side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, encouraging her. When the contractions got bad, Grace gripped his hand hard enough to bruise, and Gideon never once complained. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the mountains, the baby came. Gideon caught their child, wrapped it in a clean blanket, and placed it on Grace's chest. It was a boy, red-faced and screaming lustily with a shock of dark hair. "A son," Gideon breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "We have a son." Grace looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart expand to make room for this new love. Their son, the miracle they had created together. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Gideon thought for a moment. "Gabriel, for an angel, because he is a gift from heaven." "Gideon Fletcher," Grace said, testing the name. "It is perfect." Little Gabriel proved to be a healthy, happy baby. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's delicate features. Gideon was a devoted father, constantly holding his son, talking to him, showing him the world outside the cabin windows. As Gabriel grew from infant to toddler, the cabin filled with the sounds of his laughter and babbling. Grace and Gideon watched him take his first steps, say his first words, explore his small world with endless curiosity. When Gabriel was 2, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she had an easier pregnancy, and in the spring when she was 23 and Gideon was 28, they welcomed a daughter. They named her Margaret after Gideon's mother, but they called her Maggie. Maggie was a different baby than Gabriel had been, quieter, more observant. She had Grace's green eyes and Gideon's dark hair. Gabriel was fascinated by his little sister, constantly wanting to help care for her, to make her smile. Life on the mountain settled into a new rhythm, one that revolved around the children. Grace taught them their letters and numbers as soon as they were old enough. Gideon taught them about the animals, the land, survival skills they would need living in the wilderness. The children thrived in the mountain air. They were strong and healthy, with rosy cheeks and bright eyes. They knew nothing of the cruelty of towns, the judgment of society. They only knew love and acceptance. One evening, when Gabriel was 5 and Maggie was 3, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Gabriel was in Gideon's lap and Maggie was in Grace's. The children were tired from a day of play, drowsy and content. "Tell us the story again," Gabriel requested. "About how you and Mama met." Grace and Gideon exchanged a smile. It was their children's favorite story. "Well," Gideon began, "it was a cold October night and a terrible storm was raging on the mountain. I was sitting by my fire when I heard a knock on the door." "And it was Mama," Maggie chimed in, having heard this story many times. "It was your Mama," Gideon confirmed. "She was half frozen, but even then I could see how beautiful and brave she was. Papa took care of me," Grace continued. "He gave me food and warmth and shelter. He showed me kindness when I needed it most." "And you fell in love," Gabriel said, sighing dramatically. "We did," Grace agreed. "Very much in love. And then you got married and had us," Maggie finished. "The best decision we ever made," Gideon said, hugging Gabriel close. Grace looked at her family, her husband and children, and marveled at how much her life had changed. 5 years ago she had been alone and afraid, labeled cursed by her village. Now she was blessed beyond measure. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked softly. "How happy I am," Grace said honestly. "How grateful I am that the storm led me to you." "I am the grateful one," Gideon replied. "You are my blessing, Grace. You and these children are everything good in my life." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The children fell asleep in their arms, safe and loved. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to their happiness. Years passed in a blur of joy and hard work. Gabriel and Maggie grew into fine children, then young adults. Gabriel had his father's size and strength, and Maggie had her mother's quick mind and healing touch. They were taught reading, writing, mathematics, philosophy, and practical skills. They could ride horses, hunt, garden, and survive in the wilderness. When Gabriel was 12, Gideon began taking him on trading trips to Harmony Ridge. The boy needed to learn about the wider world, to understand society even if they did not live in it. Gabriel was cautious at first, having heard stories of how people could be cruel, but the people of Harmony Ridge were kind, and he learned to navigate town life. Maggie, when she was old enough, went too, though she was less interested in town than her brother. She preferred the mountain, the quiet, the peace. She had her mother's gift for healing, using herbs and knowledge to tend to injuries and illnesses. Grace taught her everything she knew. Grace and Gideon added more children to their family over the years. 2 more sons came along, and then another daughter. The cabin had to be expanded multiple times to accommodate everyone, growing from the simple one-room structure into a sprawling home. Through it all, Grace and Gideon's love never wavered. They still took time to sit together in the evenings to talk, to simply be with each other. They still looked at each other with the same love and wonder they had felt that first winter. One night when they were alone on the porch, their older children having moved into their own cabins nearby and the younger ones asleep inside, Gideon took Grace's hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving civilization behind, living this isolated life?" Grace looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Do you?" "No," Gideon said firmly. "I just want to make sure you are happy, that you do not feel like you missed out on anything." "The only thing I would have missed out on is this," Grace said, gesturing to their home, their life. "If I had stayed in Taylorsville or gone to some other town, I would have lived a half-life, always afraid of judgment, always hiding who I really am. Here I am free, I am loved, I am exactly where I am meant to be." "I feel the same," Gideon said. "You saved me, Grace. I was content before, but lonely. Now I am happy." "We saved each other," Grace corrected. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. After all these years, Grace still sometimes thought about that terrified girl who had stumbled through a snowstorm, looking for shelter. She hardly recognized that person anymore. That Grace had been broken, afraid, alone. This Grace was whole, confident, surrounded by love. The village had called her cursed, but Gideon had called her his blessing, and he had been right. Their love was a blessing. Their children were blessings. This life they had built together was the greatest blessing of all. When Gabriel turned 18, he announced that he wanted to stay on the mountain, to build his own cabin and start his own family. He had met a girl in Harmony Ridge, a kind young woman named Sarah, and they planned to marry. Grace and Gideon welcomed her into the family with open arms, and Sarah adapted to mountain life with surprising ease. Maggie, when she was 17, surprised them by saying she wanted to study medicine properly. She wanted to go to one of the bigger towns, maybe even a city, to learn from doctors. Grace and Gideon struggled with the idea of their daughter leaving, but they supported her dream. "You taught me to heal," Maggie said to her mother, "but I want to learn more to help more people. I will come back, I promise. This will always be home, but I need to do this." Grace understood because she remembered the importance of following your own path. They took Maggie to Billings, Montana, and found her a place to apprentice with a doctor there. It was hard saying goodbye, but Grace knew Maggie would thrive. And she did. Maggie wrote letters regularly, telling them about her studies, the cases she helped with, the things she was learning. True to her word, she came home for visits, and eventually she did return permanently, bringing with her a wealth of knowledge and a quiet young doctor named Thomas, who had fallen in love with her passion for healing. They built a small clinic down the mountain, closer to where people could reach them, and spent their lives helping those who needed it. Grace had never been more proud. As Grace and Gideon grew older, their hair graying and their bodies showing the wear of a life of hard work, they remained as devoted to each other as ever. They became grandparents many times over, and the mountain valley that had once held a single lonely cabin now had a small community of their descendants. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration. All their kids, their spouses, and their grandchildren gathered at the original cabin, which Grace and Gideon had kept as their own while the family expanded around them. There was food and music and laughter. Gabriel made a toast, thanking his parents for showing him what true love looked like. Maggie spoke about her mother's strength and her father's kindness. The grandchildren performed a play they had written about the night Grace and Gideon met. As Grace watched her family, all these beautiful people who existed because she had been brave enough to walk into a storm and Gideon had been kind enough to open his door, she felt overwhelming gratitude. Her life had not been easy, but it had been good, so very good. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Grace and Gideon sat together on their porch one more time. They were in their 50s now, no longer young, but their love had not aged a day. 30 years, Gideon mused. It feels like both forever and no time at all. "I know what you mean," Grace said, leaning against his shoulder. "I can still remember that first winter so clearly, learning to live together, falling in love." "I knew I loved you before winter was even over," Gideon admitted. "I was just afraid to say it, afraid you would leave when spring came." "I knew I loved you around the same time," Grace said. "But I was afraid you only saw me as a responsibility, someone you were helping out of obligation." Gideon laughed softly. "We were both fools, wasting time being afraid." "But we figured it out," Grace said. "That is what matters." "We did," Gideon agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you remember what I said to you that first night, when you told me about my father's death? You said I was not cursed," Grace recalled. "You said I was a blessing." "And I was right," Gideon said firmly. "You are my blessing, Grace. You have been from the moment you appeared at my door, and you will be until my last breath." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "And you are mine. My mountain man, my love, my home." They kissed, a soft press of lips that held 30 years of love and commitment and partnership. When they pulled apart, they simply held each other, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the sounds of the mountain night. Grace thought about the girl she had been, the one labeled cursed by her village. She thought about the fear and pain of that time, about walking into the wilderness with no plan and no hope. She thought about the storm and the cabin and the large, gentle man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. The village had been wrong about her. She was not cursed. She had never been cursed. She had been exactly where she needed to be, going through exactly what she needed to go through, to find her way to this mountain, to this man, to this life. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best outcomes. Sometimes being rejected by one place was the push needed to find where you truly belonged. Sometimes a curse was really just a blessing in disguise. Grace had been labeled cursed by her village, but the mountain man had called her his blessing, and together they had built a life more blessed than either had ever dreamed possible. They had built a family, a legacy, a love that would endure long after they were gone. As they sat together on that porch, hands clasped, hearts aligned, Grace knew that if she had to do it all over again, face all the same trials and pain and fear, she would gladly, because it had all led here, to this mountain, to this man, to this love, to home. And that was the greatest blessing of all.